Hi, this is Mitch Priestley. Thank you for joining our program today. Here I'm hosting this program as we're interviewing author, speaker, and trainer Beth Genly. Beth Genly is the co-founder of a company called Burnout Solutions and also the co-author of a book called Save Yourself from Burnout, a system to get your life back. Beth, thank you for joining us here in the studio today.
Glad to be here, Mitch.
I'm fascinated by this book that you've recently written. Can you tell us about the authorship of this book and really the main topic?
Sure. I wrote the book with Dr. Marnie Loomis, who's a naturopathic physician, and I am a retired nurse midwife. So both of us had personal difficult, painful experience with burnout. And Dr. Loomis introduced me to the fact that there are 4 decades of medical and sociological research that tell us a lot about how to recover from burnout or not get in it in the first place. And burnout, of course, is that state of just complete overwhelm and emotional collapse that can happen when the stress of life, work, family, all of that gets to be too much and you don't have the skills, attitudes, and habits to recover.
Okay, I see. So it sounds to me as if prior to your book, there was not a solution that was research-based, and that your book has really filled a void in this area. What have you found to be the causes and contributors to burnout?
So burnout comes from overwhelming stress, and there are 3 components to it, and if I talk about those 3, it'll give you a sense of what contributes to it. The first component of burnout is emotional exhaustion, which is also felt as physical exhaustion, bone deep, soul deep exhaustion, as it becomes harder and harder to relate to the people around you in a compassionate way. The second level is called disconnection or cynicism, which is a furthering of that distress where you're disconnected from people due to the emotional exhaustion. And then finally, and for me the most distressing piece, is a sense that your work does not make a difference, even if you knew well before that it did, and now you've just arrived at the place where it feels like there's no point. Right? So those are very painful things to feel.
Well, Beth, I'm fascinated in your personal story and how
Yes.
it is that you came to be someone whom businesses look to consult within their organizations to prevent burnout or also to treat burnout and prevent its recurrence, how you came to author a book and really fashion an entire career about the prevention and the curing of burnout. Tell me, how did you end up in this field?
Well, first I ended up in burnout, really difficult, painful burnout. I was a nurse midwife, so I kept crazy hours. I delivered babies at Oregon Health and Science University and did that for about 20 years, most of it at OHSU. And I loved what I did. I adored what I did. There was nothing better for me than to have my pager go off at 3 in the morning. I just leaped out of bed with this joy. And that just vanished over time. I had centered myself so much on how much I loved my work that I burned out, and I didn't understand it. I felt like a wimp. I felt like I had a character flaw. I felt like I wasn't good enough. People around me were not talking about it. So when I met Dr. Marnie Loomis some years after I left the field, and she told me there were 4 decades of research on burnout and that there were answers out there, I was really excited, and we also got along really well. We think in very similar ways, and we started to develop a system that was not tips and tricks, that was not opinions, that was not based on clinical experience only, but also based on all of this research that's out there. And we really tried to make it, I believe we did make it, personalized, so that when a person is going through the system, they find out where they're already well protected and where they have dropped important skills, attitudes, and habits over the side that they need to bring back so that their boat sails well and doesn't sink.
So as you've taken this research knowledge and these solutions into organizations and implement them in order to deal with burnout successfully, what have you found occurring within these organizations? And do you have a story perhaps from within a company or a nonprofit? Maybe give us a flavor of the types of businesses that you work with.
Sure. So I've worked a great deal with teachers, and K-12 teachers are famous for having a very high level of burnout. And the first thing that happens is that people develop a vocabulary for talking about burnout. they move away from this sense that it's a character flaw or that they're a wimp somehow, and into a sense of, okay, this is a process that I can control and I can reverse, and therefore I can talk about it with my colleagues and with my boss. And that in itself produces tremendous relief for people. And then as they develop their burnout shield, which is what our system is called, really individualized to themselves, they begin to have a fast visual way to stay on top of this, so that even in a very complex, demanding life, they can move away from burnout and into loving their work and their life again. So I see this as a process that we start in the workshops, and then it goes back to the workplace and becomes a part of kind of their way of managing their own environment. I've also worked with engineers, especially project management engineers and other types of engineers. I've worked with salespeople, I've worked with doctors, and a very similar process happens. We go from stigma and shame and not talking about it because it feels very personal and like a personal problem, to an expansiveness and connecting that helps people move forward and recover their joy in their work.
So the first part of your book deals with identifying the symptoms of burnout, identifying it in yourself and in others.
Yes.
What are some of the things that you cover in that first portion of your book that allow people to realize that burnout is a problem that they are experiencing and that they should find solutions?
So we have an exercise that we do, that I often do in workshops as well, where we ask people to imagine each of those three dimensions of burnout: the emotional exhaustion, the cynicism and disconnection, and the feeling that your work doesn't matter. To imagine what that feels like from the inside. I usually position myself as your coworker or your boss or your spouse feeling this. How would that feel from the inside? Then we talk about, if I'm not talking about it, if I think there's a stigma, if I'm ashamed to reveal this, how does that look from the outside? And then how would advice work if you did not know what was going on, and what would be a better way to go at it? So we talk about depression, we talk about disconnection, we talk about crankiness, we talk about losing community with your family and with the people around you. We talk about overloading your plate because you always feel more obligated to care for other people than for yourself, and so on and so forth, and develop that vocabulary so people can say, oh, I have a million problems, but some of them are the same problem. At root, some of them are burnout. So let's deal directly with the burnout instead of trying to solve these other problems.
Well, that sounds terrific.
Yeah.
Now, in Save Yourself from Burnout, the book that you co-authored, the second section deals with something you mentioned a few minutes ago, which you call the shield. Could you explain how you define that and what that does?
Sure. So the burnout shield is the system that individualizes where you are protected from burnout and where you're vulnerable.
Oh, I see.
So we have 5 areas, and you go through a self-test in each of these 5 areas, and you discover, hey, I'm already doing that. I didn't know it was something that was powerfully protective from burnout, but now I'll keep doing it. And hey, I used to do this, and I dropped it over the side because it didn't seem important, but I'm bringing it back. And hey, I didn't even know about this one. So you do that in those 5 areas, and you actually end up drawing a shield for each of those. You connect the 5 dots and color it in, and that shows you where you are protected from the slings and arrows of outrageous stress, and where you are exposed to those slings and arrows, and where you need to expand your shield.
Okay, so it sounds like your book, Save Yourself from Burnout, actually equips you with a way to avoid burnout.
Yes.
Well, if the first portion of your book deals with diagnosing the problem or recognizing it exists, and the second portion deals with the burnout shield, tell me, what is the third portion of your book?
So the third portion, we go into each of those 5 areas in much more depth and talk about the habits, attitudes, and skills that you can develop. And it's designed, the book is, so you can kind of hop into, okay, I need more information about this bit, and this bit I already know, so I'll hop over that. So we have a chapter for each of those 5 areas, and we fill it with a lot of stories about our clients and ourselves, so it moves along. It's kind of fun to read, I think. And then the final chapter talks about how to stay out of burnout, because in our life, I've had burnout 3 different times without recognizing it as burnout any of those times, and now I know what to do to not fall into it yet a 4th time.
And that's why you capped your book off with the final chapter on preventing it in the future?
Exactly, exactly.
So it's not going to recur.
Exactly.
I once had a health professional tell me the most common injury is the re-injury, and you mentioned you've experienced burnout 3 times, but it sounds like you won't be experiencing it again.
I trust not. The other thing, you bring up an interesting point. We define burnout as very similar to a repetitive stress injury, like tennis elbow. You know, if you had tennis elbow, you would learn how to hit the ball better, and you would probably lay off hitting the ball for a little while you let it heal. You would not think, oh, I'm a terrible person because I have tennis elbow, right? And so burnout is the same. It's a repetitive stress injury, and when you realize that it's an injury, then you can allow yourself to heal and change your activities so that you don't get into that same boat again.
Well, Beth, how do companies get in touch with you in order to engage your services to help their organizations deal with burnout?
Well, I'd be excited for them to go to our website, which is burnout-solutions.com. They can contact me by email at beth@burnout-solutions.com. Or they can join our Facebook page, which is called creatively Burnout Solutions, without a hyphen, and I'm more than happy to interact with them there as well.
Oh, great. Well, Beth, thanks so much for joining us on our program today.
I'm very excited to be here. Thank you.
Today we visited with Beth Genly, who is the co-founder of Burnout Solutions and the co-author of a new book, Save Yourself from Burnout, a system to get your life back. Thanks again for joining us today, and we hope that you will join us again.